Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. Now in this episode we're going to look at a particular type of human risk, pink collar crime. That's probably not a phrase you've heard before, so luckily my guest this time, Kelly Paxton, is an expert in that space and is going to help us understand what it is, how serious the issue is, and what we can do to mitigate it. So sit back and enjoy a conversation I had with Kelly Paxton on pink collar crime. So Kelly, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining. I'm really excited about the topic that we're going to talk about today.
I am absolutely honored to be here today.
It's my pleasure. Let's get started with that topic because it's a term that was, I must admit, new to me, which is pink collar crime is what you specialize in. I should add that means you understand it, not that you perpetrate it. Can you explain to listeners what is pink collar crime?
Sure. So I have the domain name pinkcollarcrime.com, but I did not come up with it. It actually was popularized in 1989 by Dr. Kathleen Daly, a criminologist. And the definition is lower level employees, primarily women who steal from the workforce. But the key there is petty amounts, lower level employees, primarily women, not all women. So one of my things is it's position, not gender. Women are in those type of positions, accounts receivable, accounts payable, office manager. So I like to start it out where it's not just women. Men can do it. It's the position.
But how does one get interested in that topic? It's a sort of fascinating career move.
So I started my career in finance, actually. I started at the Chicago Board of Trade. I became later a stockbroker and a bond trader. And we had one of our clients arrested for wire fraud. And I became a special agent for U.S. Customs. And I arrested your typical sort of bad guys, money launderers, drug dealers, child, pedophiles. And then my husband got a job in the middle of the country. So I had to leave Customs because there was no border. And then I hung around the periphery of law enforcement. And I eventually came back to Portland, Oregon, where my home is, and worked for the local sheriff's office as their fraud analyst in their fraud team. And all of a sudden one day, I'm like, all my suspects are women, except for one man who I say stole like a woman. But it was different. It wasn't bad guys. It was like nice, regular women that kind of looked like me. And so it was just like I Googled like women stealing, women embezzlers. And all of a sudden I find this term pink collar crime and the rest is history.
So when we think about pink collar crime, the examples that you have on your website, the things that you've spoken about in pieces you've done before, this is widespread and this is happening everywhere. And one of the things you talk about is relatable crime. Why is this so widespread and how does this happen?
Well, so I'll go to say a social event and people will find out what I do and they'll sit there and they'll kind of I have a friend. And it turns out, Kevin Bacon's 6 degrees of separation, embezzlement and theft is only 1 or 2 degrees. They come up and they're like, well, this happened to me or this happened to my kid's school. And so that's why I call it the relatable crime. Everyone knows someone or some business or some government that has been, ripped off by a trusted employee.
And why is it so prevalent?
Well, you have the fraud triangle, which is opportunity, pressure, and rationalization. And most people say you can only control for opportunity. I'm a little squishy there right now because I do think you can control a little bit for the rationalization. If you have a really cruddy tone at the top, your employees are going to be able to justify their bad behavior by them seeing your bad behavior. So again, it can be a little, I'm going to say contagious, not in the embezzlement, but in just the bad tone at the top. So you'll see, I use this example, a business owner, say, goes to a convention and he brings or she brings their whole family. They come back, they hand their Black American Express bill to the office manager and they say, pay the bill. And the office manager knows you have taken your family to that event. And they're like, well, how do you want me to break this out? And the office manager or the business owner will say, just pay it. It's none of your business. Now, right then and there, the office manager knows you're ripping off the government by writing off a $20,000 trip that you should only write off, maybe 10,000 of. So it might be 6 days, 6 weeks, 6 months. Then all of a sudden your kid texts you one day and they're like, I need, money for my school club. And you might just revert back to, my boss steals from the government. It's $200. I'm doing it. And then it just snowballs.
It's copycat to the extent of breaking the rules, but it's obviously not copycat in terms of doing the same thing. But what you're effectively saying is I take permission from the fact, or I can morally justify it because they're doing it. So you know it's not acceptable, but they're doing it so it's sort of prevalent and therefore it's okay to do it.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, and I don't think these are bad people. This is another thing that I really like to make clear. And I had a LinkedIn post this week and they were shaming the victim. And it's do not shame the victim. Only 15 to 20% of all embezzlement cases get turned into law enforcement. And it's because a story like that broke this week, $500,000 embezzlement, you go on the news Facebook page and they're like, how did that dumb business owner not see that? That doesn't do anyone any good. Right. No good at all.
It's kind of interesting, right? Because I presume that reaction is almost the moral high ground, right? Which is, I wouldn't have let that happen in my organization, and you're an idiot for allowing it to happen in yours, presumably backed by some kind of narrative around you've hired a wrong un. And if your recruitment was better and your controls were better, this wouldn't have happened to you. And I'm not as dumb as you are. And there's a little bit of gloating. But of course, the evidence of the cases that you highlight is that this is, and the frequency of it is this is happening everywhere. So it is clearly not a case of we have dumb bosses out there who can't see this stuff and everybody else is brilliant at managing it. It seems to be fairly pervasive across society. Yeah.
So I call that optimism bias. We never think we're going to get cancer. We never think, that we're going to get robbed. And when someone does, get embezzled, I'm just going to use a male business owner. He's out on the golf course with his buddies. He's embarrassed to say, oh yeah, that office manager of mine ripped me off to the tune of $250,000. They have shame, they have humiliation, but if they actually ask their friends would say, oh yeah, it happened to me too. It's like the secret society. And then when it breaks open, all of a sudden everyone is talking about it. I had a guy who, when he first met me, I knew his wife forever. He's a master of the universe, very successful. He first meets me and he says very confidently, I'll never have to hire you. No one would dare rip me off. I hire good people. I pay good money. Sure enough, 18 months later, his wife calls me and she's like, he's on the phone. He gets on the phone. He's like, my office, 9:00, attorneys, I've been ripped. And it was $750,000 by his trusted lieutenant. And so now he's one of my biggest proponents. He's like, oh yeah, she came in, she knew exactly what had happened. But here was a guy who thought because he had made a ton of money, he's uber successful, no one would dare steal from him. Well, there was an open door and the guy took it because he had a gambling problem. His lieutenant had a raging gambling problem.
Looking at some of the cases that I've seen you highlight before, it seems to be that people who get themselves into personal difficulties or have, financial constraints, should we say, find this as an easy way to get out. So you need to fund it for your kid or some other treatment. Or maybe you've got yourself into trouble through gambling or you have some lifestyle challenge, you want that expensive car. And therefore this is just an easy way of solving that problem. Is that a fair depiction?
Yeah, it's kind of an easy way. They all think they're going to pay it back, unless, you're Bernie Madoff. But you all think most will say that they're going to pay it back. And they'll even keep track of it. Granted, they round down. So I have the 2 to 6 factor. So if you get, say, a nice office manager and she confesses to you and she says, I stole 100,000, multiply that between 2 and 6 because they round down. They minimize it a lot. I've had ones literally keep a spreadsheet. They've kept the EOB check deposits in the back of their desk. They keep track of it. And then they're like, the number gets kind of big. So I just stopped.
And the logic being, I'm genuinely going to pay it back, or I think I might pay it back, or I feel like I ought to document it.
At first, I think they truly think they're going to pay it back. I had a woman who, she wrote checks. She forged checks. And it was kind of funny. She couldn't forge the president of the company's check, but his younger brother, who was the vice president, she could forge his signature all day long. It was much easier signature to forge. But every check, the last 4 digits of the amount of check was a specific number for her, like her anniversary, her kids' last 4 digits of their social security. So said that if she ever did have to pay it back, got to be able to pay it back, he could look at the checks and know exactly which ones were the fake checks. And I thought fascinating.
Wow. That's a little bit premeditated, right? That's really interesting because it's not sort of, there's a logic behind that.
Yeah. The gamblers, especially like the gamblers, they think they're going to hit it big and maybe win a mega bucks or something like that. What are you going to do? Go to your boss and say, oh, here's the $2 million I stole? I mean, a woman did go to her boss and confess. And, she thought she'd pay the money back. and all would be good. He'd fire her, of course. But no, she had a baby in federal prison because he was so angry at her. And she, she went to prison. She confessed to him. He hadn't have caught it. And she went and she confessed. You can't just make a journal entry and say, okay, here's the money, and put stolen money returned. I mean, the accountants are going to catch that.
Yeah, but I mean, seemingly that's a logic you go through to sort of give yourself permission to do this, because in very simple terms, it's just another debtor, right? That the organization has, and you put yourself in the books in the same way, and then it spirals out of control. And I think it's really interesting when you took, I've got a reasonable amount of experience in looking at things like rogue traders in banks. Okay, so the sums of money typically involved are much larger because these things only get known when they cause massive problems and get found out. But the logic you've talked about, it's exactly the same stuff for them. It's small things. There is an intention to gamble your way out of trouble, and often it's about keeping your job rather than maintaining a lifestyle because you've made a mistake. But the logic they use is to build up the same thing, and they kind of go, it's okay because if I keep trading, I'll trade my way out of trouble, because if I have infinite liquidity, eventually I can make the money back, and that's kind of logical. But the steps that you talk about, it's exactly the same stuff. It's these baby steps, small things, and they probably do approach it in a way that's kind of documentable and diligent. And then after a while, it leads to a life of its own. So I'm fascinated by that read across. There seems to be something we can learn about these smaller things. And as you say, there are smaller sums involved in many cases, but actually the principles and the way people behave is kind of interesting and relevant for larger scale crime as well.
Yeah. There's a woman who's in prison in Wisconsin. The first time she stole it was $10. She was only making like $10.25 an hour. And she said in court, no one noticed. I have a friend who owned a family business, and she noticed that the bookkeeper, when she went to Costco, bought a couple pairs of extra jeans. She told her brother, she said, we need to fire her. She bought stuff that, she wasn't supposed to. He says, oh, it's no big deal. Well, a couple of years later, $500,000 had walked out the door. It started with a couple pairs of jeans at Costco.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I thought there's a really interesting thing you talk about, going around and checking what cars people are driving, because that's an interesting indicator as to something not quite being right if they have a car that's not commensurate with their income. Yeah,
the parking lot audit. So
right.
I worked at a large sporting goods company, and there are two people there who are no longer there who had brand new, beautiful Range Rovers. And I joked to my boss, if I ever get bored here, I'll just go around the parking lots and pull expense reports of the Range Rover owners. And he's like, don't do that. But, if you are paying your admin $40,000 a year and she or he comes into work in a $120,000 car, something's up. Like, it just doesn't, does the car match the salary? And, I joke about the Range Rovers and the parking lot audit, but it's also like the trips. If you're paying your, office manager even $100,000 a year and they're renting a villa in the south of France and they're flying private, it's a problem.
That should not be happening. But it's interesting. So it's kind of obvious, right? So sort of if you are embezzling money, you're going to want to do something with that cash, right? And so for many people, it's funding a lifestyle that they wouldn't otherwise be able to fund. But from what you're saying, they're doing this stuff in plain sight. Right. It is pretty obvious, once I follow your logic, that I shouldn't be turning up with a car that's disproportionate to my income because it might arouse suspicion. And yet they seem to do this. And the jeans, I think, is an interesting example. Is there any sense you've got that people, I don't know, they think they can get away with it? It doesn't occur to them? Because you would think logically you keep it quiet. That's the most sensible way to keep your ill-gotten gains under the radar.
Well, I joke I could embezzle from my husband all day long. He has no idea what fine Italian leather boots cost, because when I bring him home, I round down. So, and he doesn't know what, good shampoo costs. And so we get used to the better lifestyle. And a lot of times, if it is a woman that steals, the victim will say, how did the husband not know? A lot of them put their heads in the sand. There's a woman who stole $2 million from a mega church in California. And I asked her, because she reached out to me, I asked her, did your husband know? And she says, he will go to his grave saying he didn't know. She said, but there was one day, she goes, I remember I was getting ready for work in the morning and a friend of ours' house came for sale. And he came in and he said, I want that house. And she's like, we can't afford it. And he looked at her and he said, I don't care how, get that house. And she said, that's when I knew he knew that what I was doing. So,
wow.
Yeah. So she's out of the church. He's in the church and he's remarried and he's having a grand old time.
But this embarrassment factor, I think, is really interesting. because if you admit that you knew what was going on, you should have done something about it. And I guess with all of the cases, right, there were opportunities or early signs or things that people could have done if they had thought to look for it or paid more attention to what was going on or had more of an eye for the detail in their organizations. And yet we don't want to be embarrassed enough in saying that we didn't spot things that were happening that possibly we ought to have done. And there is this seems to be a huge part in the non-detection piece because, whether it's you call it willful blindness or whether you are just arrogant enough to assume that it could never happen to you, there's something fascinating in the way that people allow this to happen effectively on their watch.
So I just finished Malcolm Gladwell's newest book, Talking to Strangers. And, we have this truth default. We default to the truth. We default to trust. We can't really, I joke, I trust no one, but I couldn't get out of bed in the morning if I didn't trust anyone. But we want to believe people. We want to think people are good because otherwise, if we didn't trust anyone, nothing would get done. I mean, he gives a great example of so you go to your dentist and the dentist is like, you have a cavity. Are you going to argue with your dentist that, how do you know I have a cavity? Is that x-ray machine? We have to default to the truth. So I think it's a good thing that people default to the truth. I just think that, if something doesn't look right, doesn't smell right, you need to kind of take a look at it. There was a guy south of Portland who he looked out his window one day and he saw, a nice brand new Cadillac Escalade with his admin. Well, $800,000 she stole from him. And it was him just looking out the window. So I say just be observant, not too snoopy like me, but be observant.
I guess it's sort of hard, right? Because you spend your time looking, what the telltale signs are. And we should come on to some of those in a bit, just so listeners have something to take away that they can be observant about. But it's sort of hard because, as you say, you're pre-wired to assume the best in people because you've hired them and it's unpleasant having an environment where no one is trusted and so on and so forth. But there are these telltale signs and sometimes they can be blindingly obvious. You sort of tell a story there about people whose lifestyles were so obviously out of sync with their income. That ought to have been a trigger point and a warning sign, and yet people missed it.
We have to trust people. We definitely have to trust people. But it's weird in the economy that we're in. We have a lot of people have side hustles. So there was a woman who stole $10 million from a car dealership, big car dealership. And she was flying private and she was going to the Super Bowl and people would ask and she'd go, we were blessed. Or we made, we've done well in the stock market. People talk more about sex than they talk about money. And so if you have someone who's flying private and, going to the Super Bowl in a box, you're not going to ask them, hey, how do you afford that? You're just probably the green monster of envy is going to come out and go, God, I need to work harder. But when someone says we've been blessed or I've got a side hustle, that kind of shuts you down.
In your experience, how sophisticated are the excuses these people come up with if they are confronted?
Oh, God, they're not sophisticated at all. So first off, I was just talking to a cop this morning and he was pretty funny. And he said that he thinks, and this is anecdotally, in his experience, male fraudsters are much more manipulative in the interviews than female fraudsters. Female embezzlers. And he says the female ones will generally, confess. This is anecdotal. In my experience, that is true. They will confess and you can actually see a physical relief on their body because they also kind of know they're always going to get caught. Eventually, they're going to get caught. And so when you confront them and, do this with legal counsel, don't do this on your own, be prepared.
Right.
Yeah, do not falsely accuse anyone. Chipotle got paid $8 million for falsely accusing an employee of theft. $8 million. So, but women will generally confess pretty quick. Now, this is different in the behavioral economic sort of world. I'm talking about good people making bad choices. The serial grifters, the serial con artists, they're a whole different thing. Like you say, bad people are going to do bad stuff, but these are good people doing bad stuff. So when they're caught, there is a sense of relief. It's like, oh God, this is over. Thank God I can come clean.
Which is strange, really, because it's you would sort of think if the prospect of getting caught loomed large, right, you wouldn't go into this. From what you've said, if they're genuinely relieved when they're caught, then there's a sense of they sort of know that this is where it's going to end up. And yet their behavior is driven by opportunism, very short-term thinking. I find this fascinating, those two kind of contradictory things.
A lot lot of the cases I've investigated, there has been a true financial need at first. Like, the woman who stole $350,000, her son got thrown in jail. She had a second husband. They had, some difficulties in their marriage, and she just wanted to get her son out of jail and not tell her husband how she did it. So she stole the first time. So there was a financial need, and that happens a lot of times, but then they just get used to the money. I had a young woman who she got used to the money, and her boyfriend got used to the money, and they liked going out to the Olive Garden instead of McDonald's. And it just kind of like, it's the slippery slope. And it's like when you get a raise, you get, say a 10% raise a year. All financial people say, put that 10% into your retirement and don't even pretend it's there. But you're like, oh, I'll do it next paycheck. And then next thing you know, it's gone. So yeah, I mean, at first it can be a need, and then they just get used to it. And it's like, life is just easier with more money, which, I mean, we all know that's not true.
And the more I hear you talk about it, the more I'm kind of going to be looking for it everywhere now. What you've told is a series of stories in different scenarios. So this isn't just one industry. This isn't just one type of individual. This is pervasive across the piece. And I mean, what do we do to stop this from happening if we can?
If you're a business owner, one of the things, I'm talking to smaller business owner, mail your bank statements home, or to a PO box that only you can control, because I can make your bank statement look, awfully good when in fact you've got $5.38 in it. So that's an easy, free thing to do. Mail your bank statements home. And this is a crazy one. Make your employees take vacations. So some of the biggest embezzlements have been caught when someone can't get into work, because these employees are there all the time. There's a woman, Bernice Geiger, who stole from her own father's bank it was for a long period of time. She was caught in 1961, the equivalent of $17 million. When she was caught, she was exhausted because she said she could never take a day off of work. And sort of the younger generations, they take these microcations. Microcations don't count. You need a week or 2 weeks. They need to be gone, because if you're gone 1 or 2 days, no one's going to look at your work. But if you're gone a week or two, someone has to look at your work. So vacations, I mean, it's good for all sorts of things, but it's really good for fraud.
That's something that banks have picked up on, again, with rogue traders in mind, is forcing what they call block leave, where you actually get shut out. And they've thought this through a little bit more than just saying you mustn't walk through the door, but they've shut off your remote access, making sure that you can't access emails. And there's a mental health angle there, but it's clearly around, as you say, it's around making sure someone else has to look at your book. So it requires you to collude with other people to be able to get away with this thing. So I think that's a fascinating concept. I mean, do you think, I'm always struck by the US's tradition that I've never understood of having less vacation than the rest of us, because in Europe it's 4 or 5 weeks is standard. In the US is 2 weeks. Does that make a difference?
Yeah. I used to think I could take my little pink collar crime tour and go all over the world and do it, but it seems to be more of like a US, I'm going to also say, England, Canadian, Australia, New Zealand problem. And I don't know if that's because women feel in sort of these countries that they're not, there's gender disparate or, discrepancies. But yeah, we don't take a lot of vacation here, except for me. No. I mean, I think vacation is great. But yeah, Bernice Geiger she's one of the ones, she went and she consulted for the precursor to the FDIC. And the people she looked at were people who weren't taking vacations. Much as like I look at people who drive Range Rovers, she looked at people who didn't take vacation. I don't know why it is in the US. It's just, I think we are getting better though. I definitely think we are getting better.
I'm really interested by the comment you made about English-speaking countries.
I did a presentation and someone from India, like it was an online webinar, someone from India said, well, I'm not going to listen to that. It doesn't happen here. And they're like, well, it's free. You don't have to listen to it. But then I did another presentation with a guy who is a SIU investigator in India. And he's like, oh, it happens in India. I don't think it happens to the scale. And maybe that is because of the gender pay gap is bigger in the US than maybe say France. Right. That's the only thing that I can tie it to is the gender pay gap has been it's always been bigger in the US, I believe, than in maybe some other developed countries.
Still giggly about the guy who does it, adamantly not going to listen because it couldn't possibly happen where he is. I mean, that's always for me is like a red flag. If the more convinced you are it ain't going to happen where you are, the more likely it is it probably is happening. You're just not seeing it.
Well, that's like with fraudsters, listening to fraudsters. Some people cannot stand listening to a fraudster come to a presentation, whereas I am like, I will go see those presentations all day long because you have to understand what they did, what they were thinking at that time. If you choose not to listen, I think you're missing a huge amount. I mean, again, Tom Harden, Tipper X, you listen to him, it is just gut wrenching. And people have to understand they can make those decisions. All the people that I've, arrested, defended, at the end of the day, we're humans and we can make bad decisions.
And it's just the degree of the badness of the decision, which can be flipped on very small things. And Tom's story is fascinating in itself and the way that he explains himself. It's very small things can take you very quickly into dangerous space. And I'm fascinated by that. When you look at big crimes, it's the same as some of these smaller pieces. It's these little sort of incremental pieces, and we take ourselves into spaces that if you made the leap straight away, you might not do. But because it's incremental, it feels kind of okay and it's a bit more comfortable.
There's a great quote that I just found from Bernie Madoff, and this isn't verbatim, but he's saying to his administrative assistant, because one of his clients got ripped off by his administrative assistant. He goes, it starts small, a couple hundred, a couple thousand. You think you're going to pay it back, and all of a sudden it snowballs. And it's like, what? That's a quote from Bernie Madoff, $65 billion. And he's saying to his admin, it starts small. It's a couple hundred. It's a couple thousand. Do I honestly think that Bernie set out to steal $65 billion? No, I don't. Did he? Yes. But I don't think he woke up one day and said, I'm going to steal $65 billion. But
that's a really interesting confession that he makes to his admin, right? It's like that's a weird conversation, which is sort of almost like, is that him unburdening himself? And as we talk about that, it sort of struck me earlier when you were saying that there is copycat element to this, right? So I am the assistant and I see the big boss is kind of ripping off the tax man or ripping off the company if they don't own it themselves. And I copy. And there's something sort of interesting about that dynamic there, which you sort of wonder whether senior people couldn't have greater visibility on the sort of administrative criminality, but vice versa.
Well, so the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, they do a study, report to the nations, and they showed in the most recent one, the higher level employees don't get fired sometimes when they get caught with fraud, but the lower level employees much more likely to. And that is what, tone at the top. People in corporations know what's going on. And when they see an executive, a C-suite, level employee who is, and this is a real example, taking 4 people out to dinner at Nobu and it's $10,000 and his administrative assistant files that expense report. And then she's like, I had to stop at Starbucks to bring him coffee. I'm going to charge my coffee. And then that's how it starts. And they don't fire him because he brings in a lot of business. Yet they fire her for, buying Starbucks and then Chipotle. But
right.
A $10,000 dinner for 4, is that legitimate? And they see it. And
yeah. And I guess, is there a correlation between the effective seniority of the person that the pink collar criminal is covering in the case of admin staff? So if are you more likely to do this if you cover senior people? Because, I don't know, you see more bad behaviors or you've got access to more. Is there any correlation between that?
I don't think so. And, the thing about like embezzlement, only 15 to 20% of all cases get turned to law enforcement, is that the statistics are so incredibly messy. So you get someone who will steal, say, $200,000. They're not even charged with embezzlement. They're charged with like not paying taxes on that amount of money. So a lot of this comes anecdotally, but I wouldn't say that there's a correlation. And actually for companies that are under 100 employees, they have a bigger average loss than companies over 200. And that's because companies over 200 have more internal controls. So internal controls are so incredibly important. Segregation of duties. The person who picks up the mail is not the person who enters the check, who takes it to the bank. Little companies can't do that. But big companies, they have procedures. That would have to be all anecdotally, but I have seen it where lower level employees, it's part of the fraud triangle, the rationalization. It's like what a company spends on what they consider to be frivolous, and they're like barely making rent.
When you humanize some of these things, I love that you do this amazing thing at the moment on LinkedIn, which I would encourage listeners to take a look at, which is sort of once a week. I can't remember what you call it, but it's once a week. We kind of get a glimpse into the world that you're talking about, and you tell a little story.
Yeah. So the hashtag Friday Fraudster, that just kind of came to me, and people are loving it. And the reason I'm doing it is for people to understand they look like us. They're not bad guys. Like, these are regular, normal looking people with, variety of industries, any industry. I did a thing called Stump the Embezzlement Jock, name an industry that hasn't been embezzled. Well, a lawyer won the contest and he pushed the envelope there. It's snake wrangling. It's not really an industry, but there were probably 40 industries. Yeah, I know. Leave it to the lawyers.
Right.
There was probably 40 industries. It took me less than 5 minutes to find an embezzlement story. So I want to put that human side of it. People are like, oh, those are bad guys. No, they're people that look like you and I. And that's the whole point of the Friday Fraudster, is for people to understand that, and a huge part, not victim shaming, because I want people to bring cases to law enforcement. I want it to be able to be seen as, you will go to prison if you do this. And so it's a huge part of education. I believe in the education of embezzlement.
Yes. So this not prosecuting thing. So you presumably it is just easier to dismiss the person, get them out of the organization, and move on. Is that the logic here? And you don't want the hassle or the embarrassment of having to go through legal proceedings.
That's a big part of it. And it's also good money after bad. I mean, you have to hire someone like me to come in and do the investigation. The cops don't become cops to play with Pivot and Excel. They become cops to shoot things. So it costs money to come in. I have to be hired by an attorney. Then you also have the shame, the humiliation, and maybe, I'm going to say just maybe, it's worse than going through an audit, because you're going to turn your books over to law enforcement. And how many business owners, don't raise your hand out there, you're maybe a little squishy on, the car use, or, having your kid's car, or you're paying your home utility through the business. They don't want anyone to see that. And they're like, I don't want a cop in my business. And so there's some of that, I think, that goes on. I call it also the get out of jail free card. So say that lower level employee knows that you're paying a bunch of bills out of the company account, and you go and you confront your employee, and I've had this happen. They've said, I'll turn you into the IRS. A lot of business owners would say, you know what? Here's a week's vacation. I don't ever want to see you again. So there's everyone's got something. And business owners, they're in business to make money. Going to law enforcement is going to stop the making of the money sometimes, just for a brief period. I always tell victims, get back to work. You don't do your own root canals. You don't change your own oil. Get back to work and leave it to the professionals, because if you mess up a fraud investigation, it can cost you way more than you ever thought possible. Right,
which is interesting, because if you're a victim, that's a terrible place to end up, right? So you've discovered something's going on in your organization. You want to go and investigate, and I imagine if it's particularly egregious, your gut reaction is going to be anger as much as anything else, because of the person you trusted, and how could they do this to you, and all these sorts of things. You are liable to misstep pretty quickly. And I was struck by some of the advice on your website around, this is a crime scene. So don't go stumbling in, messing, just doing sort of DIY investigations, and don't go accusing people as you've outlined. That can be expensive if you get that wrong as well. So it requires a sort of technical skill set, and I guess you're opening up a whole can of worms around things that you're not really used to dealing with. Because if you were an experienced fraud investigator, you would probably be less likely to have fraud happening in your organization. So by default, you probably know less about how to handle this sort of topic, and therefore you do need to bring other people in. So I can sort of see why you'd want to close it down fairly quickly.
That's an awesome thing. I hadn't thought of it as a crime scene. I mean, if you had a murder in your house, would you dare touch the body? God, no. No. This is awesome. I'm so excited. I got a new LinkedIn post. You would never touch a bloody crime scene. But people feel well, it's my business, it's my money, I'm going to, touch it. It's like, no, don't touch the crime scene. I mean, it's a really good analogy. No one would ever touch a dead body or a bloody body of a crime scene, but they'll do it in a fraud investigation all day long. Like, it's my money, it's my computers, don't touch it.
Which I guess the smaller the company, the greater the offense from taking a personal perspective, from potentially the impact on your organization. So you can sort of see the temptation to clean it up and move on. But yeah, I can imagine that's not going to go down particularly well if you do bring the police in and other people, because you're presumably making it harder for them to do their job. Yeah.
Guy I told you about earlier, the master of the universe, when he found out that he got ripped off, the anger was just immense. And he's just like, I joke that he says he wanted him hung in the town square. And I'm like, no. And I'm like, this person is very public facing. And I said, we will do the case and it's going to be buried in one of your LLCs, because we don't want the local newspapers or even the national newspapers picking up on the story that you were ripped off. It's a sign of weakness. It's not really a sign of weakness if they knew how the case had, unraveled, but you're never going to get that in the media. He had private equity and VC money in his business, and they would see it as he's not paying attention. And so I was like, it took about a year for it to come through in the papers, and no one ever saw his name. So,
so it can be done.
Yeah, it can be done, but we need patience. Like even in our personal lives, we need to step back and settle down before we take that next big step, before you call law enforcement, especially if you are a high profile person, which it can happen to. I just heard about not a millionaire, a billionaire who had been ripped off. So it happens to 60% of all dentists get ripped off. That's a US thing. Dentists make good money in the US, but 60% of all dentists in the US get ripped off. But if you're a public facing person, you got to be careful.
And it's interesting when you talk about the billionaire, you can sort of see that in that context, the person doing the embezzlement can sit there and probably they can afford it.
Yeah.
It's not like I'm stealing from somebody who doesn't have much. I'm taking, it's a very small amount of somebody's very large pot, and they're not even going to notice. And. So it probably makes it easier, right? So if anything, there's a greater risk of just because of the materiality of it.
Yeah. And, that's the thing is, another hashtag is money is replaceable. Trust not so much. I joke that I'm a fraud therapist because these people, they're all successful. You had money that was there to be able to be stolen. So you had this money, it got stolen, but they don't think about the money in the long term. They think about the fact that they let this person into their home. They let this person, into their business, and that person lied to them daily for sometimes decades. I have cases where it's been over 20 years that they've stolen. So you can make more money. You can sell more widgets. You can, sell your time. You can't just manufacture trust. And that's where I'm like, it hurts. These people are a lot of times like family, and it really does hurt.
So what would your advice be to people around this? Because having this happen to you clearly causes a load of hassle and distress. And so what should we do? Should we be less trusting in the first place, and therefore run the risk of not having as strong a relationship with all the people that we're close to? How do we, what's your advice to them? What would you say to someone, if someone's had this happen to them? How do they go about hiring the replacement? Because presumably at that point, their guard is up massively. The interview process will not play out the way the previous interview process might have played out.
So this is what I love about your stuff. You can change the environment. So put those controls in place. If there's an easy opportunity to steal, a lot of people are going to take that chance.
Right.
It's like picking up $20 on the street. You look around, is there a camera? What's the difference between $20 and $2,000 or something like that? So this is where changing the environment, put those controls in place and have the really good tone at the top. So if someone does rip you off, make sure your employees know that you held that person accountable. If you don't hold them accountable, the employees are going to go, they just fired him. So, if I'm only going to get fired, who's to say I can't, help myself to a little bit. So make the environment such that the opportunity is not there. And, I will get business owners who, when they find out what I do, they're like, well, I sign all my own checks. That's not enough. That is not enough to sign your own checks. Or they'll say, I sign checks over $5,000. Well, I can steal from you $4,500 in increments all day long. really look at your systems and look to see where the money can sneak out.
But that's an interesting thing, is that, I sign my own checks. Therefore, I'm on top of this thing, and I can make sure that no fraudulent money gets sent out of my organization or out of my family, whatever it is. But of course, what's interesting about this whole thing is these people get away with the fraud because they're pulling the wool over someone's eyes. So the fact that you're signing the checks actually potentially might make it easier, because the same control that's not keeping an eye on some of the other things they're up to is the control that gets them access to the money. So you might say, rather than being a stronger control, it's actually a really bad week. What you want is someone who is dispassionate in this whole thing, that won't sit there and say, I'm going to sign these person's expenses because they're my assistant and I trust them, and I'm going to be a bit cynical. You want somebody who is, a sort of aggressive accountant to everybody and sussing out who isn't emotionally involved. So I think there's an interesting example of a control that sounds good on paper, but actually, one, leads to complacency, but two, actually potentially produces precisely the outcome you don't want. It's a lovely example of where we need to think carefully about the psychology of controls, and often we don't do that.
Yeah, so there's a woman who just got caught. She was in a car accident in Utah State. The police came to the accident, and they found a bunch of pre-signed checks from the dental office that she worked at. And sure enough, she'd been ripping off the dental office. The case wouldn't have been caught had she not been in a car accident. So that's another thing. I love auditors. Oh my God, I love auditors. I should have been an auditor, but audits don't find fraud. Audits sample, they test. They only do it in the month of July or whatever month. And, so my biggest cases have come via tip or accidentally finding it out. So if you're going to be reliant on audits, don't do it every June, mix it up. And there was a woman who knew the auditors came every June. She'd steal up until May 31st, quit for the month of June, start up again July 1st. She did it for 8 years.
It's kind of clever, right? But it's interesting because it's responding to the environment.
Right.
And therefore the environment incentivizes you that nobody says this, but implicitly, if you wish to commit fraud in this environment, here is the way that you can do it, right? And we have built a structure that facilitates that piece. Now, it's not a structure that we've built designed to allow you to do that, but that's what we've effectively built. And so if we don't change that, think about that, logically, you're going to respond to that and say, if I want to commit fraud, this is the way I can do it. So I sort of think it's another example of sort of environmental structures, not necessarily encouraging, but facilitating precisely the sorts of things we're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, it's just like, mix it up. I had a business who two owners, and one was on premise, one was off, and he thought the on premise guy was taking cash, and he wanted to hire us. He couldn't afford to hire us. And I said, send a friend in who doesn't know and see if he'll accept cash, repair the car and have the guy try and pay in cash. And if the guy accepts the cash, case over. It's not rocket science. That's one of my other hashtags. It's not rocket science. Like, this isn't cryptocurrency. This isn't money laundering. This is just garden variety embezzlement. Money goes from business takes from the victim's business and goes to the suspect. It doesn't go to Panama and Liechtenstein. It just goes from bank A to bank B and maybe to credit card C.
Well, look, to finish up, I said to you in a nutshell, what is you, apart from hire you ASAP, ideally before this stuff happens, but certainly when it has happened. But what's your kind of big ticket advice to people if they're in an organization where this might potentially be happening?
Well, I don't know how politically correct this is going to be. So I have 3 points when I do my, presentation is. First one.
I love stuff that's not politically correct on this podcast. So feel free.
First one is there is no honesty chromosome. And this from, all sorts of behavioral economics, and women are not more honest than men. We may be socialized to be more honest, but there is no honesty chromosome. The workplace is changing and it continues to change. But third, and most important, never underestimate a woman. Never underestimate a woman, because they can rob you blind. That's the politically incorrect part of it. I was on a podcast recently, and the woman's a data scientist, and she went to a business that was getting ripped off, and they dumped all the data, and she was talking to the owner of the business, and he's saying, this person does this person does that. He gets to his administrative assistant and he says to my friend, don't even look at her. She's too stupid to steal from me. Now,
whoa!
If I were there, I would say, Betty, I'm going to show you really how to steal. That's that tone at the top. And the underestimating a woman, oh my God. Like, I think I would have turned around and walked out the door. It's just, I hope she was the one stealing. just to prove him wrong. No, I don't want anyone to be stolen from. But if anyone was going to steal from that guy, it should be her.
I mean, but that's an astonishing thing to say in the 21st century on any level. They're just like, it's utterly dumb and unacceptable. And the irony is it's a statement about somebody else's stupidity. It illustrates the stupidity of the person saying it. Wow. Look, if people want to get hold of you, how do they find you and how can they find your Friday Fraudster
So
piece?
It's hashtag Friday Fraudster on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn, just Kelly Paxton. I have pinkcollarcrime.com. I have on Twitter, and I love Twitter, PDXCFE. And I tweet stories out daily. And then, of course, my website, pinkcollarcrime.com. But hit me up. I love to talk to anyone. So whether you're a victim, whether you have committed the crime, I get people who commit the crimes. I write to women in prison, and it's not just women, but I write to people in prison. So I am happy to talk to, anyone out there, whatever side of the embezzlement spectrum you are on.
Fascinating stuff. Listen, thank you so much for appearing. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I'm sure that if you're willing, we'll be having you back on the podcast to tell more stories at a future date as we continue to explore human risk. So thank you so much for joining. So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. As ever, my thanks to Kelly for appearing and to you for listening. If you're not already subscribed, you'll find the Human Risk Podcast wherever you get your quality audio content. Now, if you have got a few seconds to leave a review on iTunes or whichever platform you use, that's incredibly helpful to allow me to build the profile of the show and to continue to get the kind of high quality guests that we've managed thus far. Now, if you've enjoyed this, also have a look at the Human Risk newsletter, which you'll find at human-risk.com, and do check out the Human Risk YouTube channel, which is also available at human-risk.com. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you again very soon on another edition of the Human Risk Podcast.